Hello everyone, this is Sam Spade and welcome to another Coding Fundamentals in GML tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about scripts again. Specifically, we're going to be talking about these 5 topics. We're going to be talking about the argument array, where scripts are located or where they run in your code, the script variable and script execute, the built-in GameMaker function, script execute, JSDoc Script Comments, and just in general when to use scripts. So first, let's start with the argument array. In the Scripts Basic Part 1 tutorial, we said that you can use argument 0 through argument 15, and that you're limited to those 16 arguments. Now we're going to talk about the argument array. The argument array has the following form. It's basically referenced, set, changed, etc., just like any other array. You use the variable name argument, and then open bracket, the position in that argument array, close bracket. It's an alternative to the built-in keywords argument 0 through argument 15, and it gives you a couple additional options. The first thing to know is that you can't use both. You have to use either the argument array or the built-in argument 0 to argument 15 variables. But what the argument array allows you to do is have an unlimited number of arguments. This isn't all that helpful because if you need more than 16 arguments, you should probably be rewriting the script to take less. However, the second thing it allows you to do is actually very helpful. That is, it allows you to create a script that takes an optional number of arguments or a variable number of arguments. In other words, the script might take no arguments or it might take 5. You can't do that with argument 0 through argument 15. When you use argument 0, argument 1, you have to use the same number of arguments every single time you use that script. The argument array allows you flexibility. Because the primary way to use the argument array is to pass in a variable number of arguments, you might want to know how many arguments are being passed in. An argument count gives you the length of that array, gives you the number of arguments that have been passed into the script. So let's actually jump over to GameMaker Studio 2 right now and see a couple examples of this. To demonstrate the argument array, I'm going to use the custom script print. Basically, it's a wrapper script for show debug message that allows you to pass in multiple arguments and automatically transforms them into one long string so that show debug message can just print it to the output window. So let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so we've run the debugger, we've stopped on this script. Let's step into it and see how this works. So here we have a temporary variable called final text. We're going to take all the arguments we passed in, which again we can see are print out the numbers 1, 2, and 3. All of these arguments, transform them into one long string, and then use show debug message to print that to the output window. We're going to use a for loop using argument count, which is the number of variables that or the number of arguments that we've passed in. Again, you can see argument count 6. Come over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've passed in 6 arguments, and again, you can also see those down here, argument 0 through 5. And then using the for loop, we're simply going to check whether the argument is a string. Notice that we're referencing it just like you would an array. If it's a string, we're simply going to add it directly to final text. And then if it is not a string, if it is a number, for example, in this case, we're going to convert it to a string and then add it to final text. So you can see we're just building up that string down there. And when we are finished, you will have one long string of final text, which we can now pass the show debug message and print to the output window. Print out the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So just to summarize the argument array, it's an alternative to the built-in argument 0 through argument 15 variables. You can only use one or the other. It's an array, so you set and reference, change it exactly as you would an array, and argument count gives you the length of the array. You have to use it if you want to use scripts with a variable number of arguments. Next, let's talk about where scripts run. Scripts run inside of the instance that calls them. So we mentioned in the first tutorial that any instance can reference a script. You write a script, every single instance in your game, you can put that in the code in any object, they can run it. But the important thing to know is that the script is running inside that instance. So that script has access to all of the instance variables of the instance calling that script. This means that you can reference instance variables inside of a script directly, but that also means you have to be careful because if you reference an instance variable in a script, but can run that script anywhere, if you run that script in an instance that doesn't have that variable, you will get an error that crashes your game. But let's switch over to GameMaker Studio 2 and see a couple examples. So here we have the same object as before. We have a couple variables. It's just going to be a name, a number, and then most importantly, it's going to increment a value by 1 until it gets to 100. And we're going to do that with the script. This script right here, increment and loop, which I've got over here. So it's going to take the value, it's going to increment it by the increment value, which in this case is just 1. If the value is greater than the max, which in this case is 100, it will reset the value to 0, and it will print out the show debug message and continue on. Notice that this is all inside of a script. These are instance variables. They've turned blue. But this works because this object, or an instance of this object once we run the game, is the one calling the script. So we've run it and we can see that this script is running right here, and it's printing out the value down here, just incrementing it over and over and over again and in a loop. The fact that scripts run inside of an instance and therefore have access to that instance's variables is very useful. But again, you just have to remember to be careful. If we were to put this script, increment and loop, inside of another object, it would run this script, try to access these variables, and when these variables didn't exist, cause an error and crash the game. And before moving on, just a quick note, global and local variables aren't any different in scripts. So now let's talk a little bit about script functions themselves. Script resource names, and by a resource name, I mean the name of the script, the thing that will change color in GameMaker Studios 2 when you type it, is a number. In fact, pretty much all resources are numbers as far as I know in GameMaker Studio 2. So since they're numbers, you can actually reference them. You can assign them to variables, and you can use them with functions, so you could pass them into functions as arguments. The important thing to know is that when you want to use the script as a variable and you don't want to run the script, you need to exclude the parentheses. This will be more clear with an example, so let's switch over to GameMaker Studio 2. So here, I'm taking the script, increment and loop, and I'm assigning the value to the variable myScript. Note that if I did this, it would run this script and return whatever this script returns, which is in fact nothing, to this variable. But without the parentheses, I'm actually assigning the value that this script is to this variable. And now that we have this variable, myScript, we can actually pass it as an argument to other functions or scripts. So here, we're passing it as an argument to the built-in function script execute, which simply runs the script you're passing it. So we've run the program, and as you can see, it's functioning exactly as before. There's really no difference between this line and this line. One note is that you could also just pass in the name of scripts directly. This would work as well, but normally you want to do it with a variable. And the reason you want to do it with a variable is because now that this is running a variable, you could actually simply change the script that that variable references. So we come over here. Now we're saving increment and loop backwards to myScript. And this is a script which does the same thing as the normal increment and loop, except that it goes backwards. It decrements it and sets it to my max. So notice how we haven't changed the step event at all. It's still the exact same as before. But because we've set myScript to a different value, a different script is going to be executed. So now, when we run this script, we can see that it's counting down to 0 and looping back to 100. Script execute also has the ability to pass in arguments. So, comment this out. Now, it's the same as before, except we're passing in an argument. So, we'll use the script increment and loop optional, which takes an argument, and if you say true, it will increment and loop forward. If you say false, it'll increment and loop backwards. So here we're going to set increment and loop forwards to false, which means it should loop backwards. So we've run it and we can see, now we can see that this is looping backwards, but we just come over here and switch this to true and run it. And now we can see that it is increasing in value and looping back to 0. So that covers script execute. There are a couple other functions that you can use with scripts, but I don't use them very often, so I'll let you look them up in the manual yourself if you want to find out how they work. Next, I want to talk about JSDoc Script Comments. I've been using these in my code, so you've probably seen them in action, but there are basically 3 different ones that GameMaker allows you to use. The first is the function. You can say @function or @func, F-U-N-C. You can type the name of the function, and then you can type in the arguments. In theory, this should do something, but in GameMaker Studio 2, it mostly seems broken at the moment, so you can use it or not use it as you want. These next two, however, are very helpful. This one, param, allows you to give 3 different things. First, it allows you to give the data type the argument is supposed to be. Then it allows you to give the name of the argument. And then it allows you to say what that argument is used for. So here we have parameter, string, message, the message to print. It'll show up in GameMaker Studio 2 to show you what arguments you are supposed to use and what they do. Description is just that. You just type out a description of what the script is supposed to accomplish as a means of documenting the script. One important thing to note is that some of these features have to be turned on or off in the preferences. Going back to GameMaker Studio 2, if I type out debug, we get string message. To change what shows up down here, you have to go to File, Preferences, then go to Languages, GML, and you'll have Display Argument Types in status bar, which I turn on, and Display Argument Description in status bar, which I turn off because I find it gets a little bit too wordy down here, but you can turn those on if you like. Last but not least, I want to talk about just some general ideas of when you should use scripts. In general, you should use scripts to avoid repeating code, generalize ideas, and just overall make your code base a little bit cleaner. But, and this is more of an opinion, I don't think you should just make everything a script. I generally only make scripts out of code that I reuse multiple times. And the reason for this, which is really just sort of a function of how GameMaker Studio 2 works right now, is that all scripts go into the same resource tree. And in a larger project, it's easy to get hundreds or even thousands of scripts. And even with folders, that becomes a nightmare to navigate. The last thing to know is that GameMaker Studio version 2.3 is going to come out presumably in the next few months, who knows, and that's going to change things dramatically. In fact, it's going to make some of what we talked about in these script and functions videos obsolete. So in summary, you need to keep in mind that you have the argument array and the built-in argument variables and when to use each one. Again, I would use argument variables, the built-in argument variables, if you are always going to be passing in the same number of arguments. And I would use the argument array if you need to pass in a variable number of arguments. And I would try never to create a script that actually takes more than 16 arguments in the first place. It's important to remember that scripts, despite being able to be called by any instance or any object, do run inside of a specific instance. So they can reference instance variables, but that instance has to have those variables in order to reference them. You can also use script execute to call scripts, which is great for giving your code a lot of flexibility. One of the most common ways you'll see it applies is with state machines, where you can say something like script execute my state and then just assign a script to the variable my state. You can document your scripts with the JSDoc Script Comments, which also get you some helpful autocomplete features if you turn those on in the preferences. And you should use scripts to generalize and avoid repetition in your code to help make your code base cleaner. As always, the links on this slide will be below, along with links to the source code and the slides themselves. And that's it. Thanks for watching.